Last year I did a couple of speeches on one day that lasted a combined 4 hours. So that was not what you're looking for, I think, Natalie. Not today. I was reflecting on it. As some people have, the strangeness of political life is an interesting thing. I've been elected as a member of the legislature for the last 7 years. Before that, some of you may have heard that I was an executive director of Canadian Parents for French, but that's not where I became famous. I also worked for a previous Premier Clark. I'm working out that thing now, the different Premier Clarks, and that Premier Clark, as you know, has gone on to become, how shall I frame it, a big shot capitalist. But I've been hearing on radio these days all of the things I was responsible for in the 1990s. I want to be clear that I do apologize for the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the Canucks losing the cup in 1994, and other such things. I think one of the things, though, I've tried to do in politics and in representing people is to learn. Over the past year, in the year 2011 and 2012, I met, I think, close to 300 business organizations, had meetings, discussed with them where they saw the future of the province going. I obviously also meet with community groups, with labor groups, with other groups in the economy. One of the things that strikes me about the political debate, one of the reasons I like to meet with people, engage with people, and answer their questions at length, is that I think that we have a political debate in British Columbia and sometimes in Canada that's too much about division without difference. There is an enormous amount in Canadian public policy where there's a consensus even between the parties. You think of the debates that are currently in the United States, that will continue to be in the United States between the federal government and state governments and between the parties with respect to the issue of public health care. And the broad consensus we have in British Columbia and in Canada around single-payer health care, such that you can make a genuine argument, if you wanted to look at things on the political spectrum, that Prime Minister Harper was to the left of President Obama on those questions, as he's a supporter of the Canada Health Act and a supporter of single-payer health care. I think one of the dangerous things we have in politics is to emphasize constantly our differences beyond the state where our differences are. And so we've tried to change that. I've tried to change that because you can only start in that process, I think. I think that Premier Clark, who I think just spoke here, I think I missed her on the way out. She was going out as I was coming in. And Mr. Cummins, who's the leader of the Conservative Party, Ms. Sturck, who's leader of the Green Party, these are people who are all committed to the province. They give a lot of time and effort and energy. They're good people. And I think a political debate that concentrates on running people down is not a positive thing. Equally, in your constituencies, in your communities, you're going to have races between candidates who you admire. And really what they're doing is all admirable. Every race I run in, 4 or 5 people run, and only one wins. The other candidates, they don't get paid. You get a little bit of ego gratification that comes with being in politics, maybe. A little bit of ego deflation that comes with being in politics as well. But they contribute to the public process, and I think we should be past the time when we put people down for that. Difference is good. Real difference is good to discuss. But when we try and create divisions when differences don't exist, I think we waste a lot of time. And I think it has consequences for us as well. Get into the substantive part of it. I think that the consequence of a name-calling politics that often people don't understand is a decrease in public participation in politics, which affects us on all sides. It creates cynicism about political decisions, particularly tough ones. And it means in the last municipal elections, last round of municipal elections, in those municipalities where they had contested elections, 71% of people didn't vote. That's 1.9 million people in British Columbia. In the last provincial election, 1.7 million people didn't vote. That was 55% of the eligible voters didn't vote, didn't participate. And that means when government has to make tough decisions on the economy, society, their capacity, their mandate isn't great. And it argues for us to improve politics. I think a second, though, important reason to make that change is that the issues that we're facing today, issues of infrastructure and taxation and competitiveness and skills training and housing and homelessness and the future of our social programs, future of our economy, require us to work together much more than a political spectrum that's divided in half suggests that we can. If campaigns become bitter experiences, the work we have to do together after the campaign is undermined. And finally, the debate is really lousy. I mean, it is. I hear a debate all the time about provincial governments and the impact of provincial governments on our economy. Here is a fact. In the 1990s, 129,000 more people came to British Columbia from other provinces than left British Columbia to go to other provinces. Interesting fact. Contrary, of course, to a lot of what you hear in the public debate. Now, is that the provincial government, do they deserve the credit for that? Maybe they deserve some, maybe they don't. It's hard to say. Certainly people in BC, this dynamic economy that we have in BC deserves some of that credit. Over the last 10 years, there's been a Liberal government. 59,000 more people came to BC than left BC for other provinces. That's a good record too, by the way. Half as good, but still good. Right? But we have had now, we have a period, and this is important for our economy. We also have a 5-year period where productivity, labor productivity, has been half of the Canadian average. Right? We've had a period since the current Premier came to office, every quarter where more people have left than have come. So if the debate is about name-calling, we fail to understand the importance of what we're talking about, the fact, and the really significant fact, that people in BC have to leave for work, the fact and the significant fact that people often don't have the skills they need for the jobs that are available in BC, the fact and the significant fact that you're going to Ireland and California to find workers, which you presumably don't want to do. It's an additional cost, but also you want to employ your neighbors and your friends and your community members in your businesses. And that has to change. So we need a better debate, and from our part, we're going to have a better debate. We ran a by-election campaign which elected my friend Joe Trasolini, who's our housing critic, housing construction critic, and has responsibilities for trade. Joe ran the kind of government as mayor of Port Moody that we're going to run here, open to everyone, open to business. Joe has deep experience in your industry and in governance in our province. We ran a by-election campaign where we treated our opponents with respect and the voters with respect. And Joe did pretty well. He won 53% of the vote in a heretofore highly Liberal seat. So that's the change we need to bring. So what are the key issues? But I think the central issue, if you look at the economy in British Columbia today, the central issues are really 3. And all of them are relevant to your industry, which is, after all, larger, more significant in terms of employment than either mining or forestry, and has a significant stake in the economy. Is one of the reasons why in Metro Vancouver our economy has moved along almost in all periods with success. I think the challenges are 3. One is the productivity challenge, which relates to economic performance. We have relatively low productivity in our province, and this is a challenge for us. Think of it, we used to have higher productivity than the Canadian average here. We now have lower. It's been particularly slow in the last number of years, in spite of the fact that we've seen generally a reduction in the tax burden on corporations. And that productivity, the productivity of Canada, so we've dropped to the bottom according to the government's progress board in Canada, and Canada has dropped to the bottom of industrialized nations, and in the long run, that affects our ability to create jobs and healthy economy here. Secondly, we have an increasingly unequal economy, especially with respect to education and other questions, so that the very means we have in an economy, world economy, where control over technology is more important, fewer and fewer people are having the skills they need, or at least not enough people are having the skills they need to work in the economy now. So we have relatively high inequality. The ratio of the bottom 20% to the highest 20% is the worst in Canada. And we've had consistently high levels relative to other provinces of child poverty. And of course, those are our future entrepreneurs, our future artists. That's our future for all of us. And thirdly, we have a sustainability question, which you're also a big part of, because we clearly have a challenge in the coming decades to address these issues of emissions and the sustainability of our society. We have timber supply areas. You're from around the province. You know this, where 90% of the trees are dead, and that is related, I think clearly, to issues around climate change. So these are significant issues in the economy. So what do we do? What should our priorities be? Because in these times, government surely can't do everything. We've got to focus on a few problems. There are a whole range of things we need to do, like ensuring adequate seniors care on the one hand, and maybe, if you follow the present government, supporting one-time film events at BC Place on the other hand. There's a range of options that government has to choose between, all of which are good options, but not all of which we can choose to focus on at once. So what have I been saying for 18 months consistently, ad nauseum, again and again? I think that is almost redundant use of adjectives there. It's to talk about skills training. And it's a real difference, frankly, between the Liberal Party and the NDP. We have a significant skills shortage. When I talk about the hundreds of meetings I've had with business people, very few of those meetings with manufacturers, with people in construction, with people in forestry, with people in mining, every single meeting refers to that skills shortage in one way or another as a significant issue for the economy. And unlike other elements of the economy which we can't control, the international price of commodities, for example, the value of the Canadian dollar, this is something that's clearly in provincial jurisdiction. Right? And frankly, our record hasn't been tremendous. It is, I think, surprising, even shocking, that at a time when Don Drummond, who is an economist in Eastern Canada, who gave advice to the Ontario government that was generally seen as tough on government and government spending, he said the one thing you don't cut in these times is skills training. And the one thing they cut in last spring's budget was skills training. Right? You know it in your own industry association, CEDO. You know they did it there. You know they bragged about it in the budget. And advertising now saying you support it isn't the same thing as actually supporting it. Using that $15 million on actual skills training might have been more valuable than trying to reposition the government on an issue. The fact of the matter is that was the wrong course, inconsistent with what business wanted, inconsistent with what our economy needs. It is clearly the case and clearly problematic that when you have new projects in British Columbia and people from British Columbia are not employed in those projects, whether they're in mining or construction or forestry, that limits the economic or the positive economic effect of those projects and undermines public support for investment. And we have to do something about that. So, more than a year ago, I made a specific proposal about young people having access to post-secondary education, most of which today is not university. Most of the university space, the jobs we need, do not require university education, but other forms of education. We more than a year ago, made a specific proposal to reinstate non-refundable student grants so that no child, no young person is denied access to post-secondary education because they can't afford it. It's a bad deal for the economy, in fact, to force people because of their income at 18 to lose the opportunity to earn money and pay taxes in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. That is a bad deal for the economy. Why we made the specific proposal. Why I think we need to invest, yes, invest in these times in apprenticeship programs and support those apprenticeship programs, go the opposite direction from the current government, and ensure that those in apprenticeship programs have the supports they need to succeed. There's a lot of discussion of completion rates in apprenticeship programs, which right now in BC stand, depending on who you listen to, somewhere between 37 and 43%. But I think regardless of what we say about that, we have to acknowledge that we can do better and that other jurisdictions, including neighboring jurisdictions such as Alberta, do better in that regard. So more spaces, better completion rates for those in those spaces. And finally, I think because the problem, and you see this problem, and we may have witness to it yesterday, of people not listening to each other and working together, of announcing things without talking to the people who are affected by those things. We need to stop arguing about public education and start improving the quality of our education system, because we know that the foundation skills required to be successful in the new economy, no matter what your work is, are not sufficiently there for too many people. We value some things more than other things, and this hurts the creativity of our economy more than it should. That's a place to start. Secondly, I think because government doesn't have much money, and because our tax competitiveness is crucially important in what is a more open economy than it ever was. I mean, when the NDP came to government in 1991, when Bill Bennett came to government in 1975, when Mr. Campbell came to government in 2001, we didn't have a softwood lumber agreement to the extent we had now, the softwood lumber agreement that's currently in place, which limits the scope of what government does, essentially, effectively excluding many of the policies that used to be in place. We have NAFTA and the free trade agreement. We have other limitations in our economy. We have the fact that, let's face it, capital moves more quickly. Jimmy Pattison, who's a well-known businessman in British Columbia, says ruefully that capital is a coward. It moves, and we have to acknowledge that. So if our opportunities are little, we have to ensure that when government spends money, that it benefits people in the community. And that matters in construction, and we see some of these issues raised by your association. It also means that in other areas of procurement, we have to make sure when we spend money that as much of that money as possible stays in British Columbia, and we've proposed some specific things about that that we get into in the question and answer. And finally, because I think it's important for us to recognize that it's profoundly linked the links between the economy and the environment are important, and your industry has been a leader in this regard. I think we have to acknowledge that we have serious issues of infrastructure that will affect the long-term competitiveness of our economy if we don't address them. Everyone who lives in Metro Vancouver knows that the model that was set up at TransLink over the last number of years, since 2008, when the government, in a fit of pique, got rid of the previous model because they were unhappy about delays on the Canada line, never a good reason to make a public policy change, that we don't seem to have in Metro Vancouver the capacity to make the transportation decisions we need to make. Every project is a hard project to get through, and we are delayed in all of our plans for the necessary movement of both goods and services and people in our region. But of course it affects the whole province. When Sicamous is for months under a boil water advisory and hasn't had the means to address some of those problems, then that is fundamental for a town that, after all, depends on tourism and seniors and others to survive and succeed. These issues of infrastructure are true across the province. So here's what I've said it more than a year ago, said what we were going to do, said how we were going to pay for it. I've said that we have to take some of the money connected to the carbon tax, because none of that money went to pay for infrastructure, and ensure that that money goes back into communities to support in critical infrastructure, particularly green infrastructure. I think it's hard for people today who live in Langley and don't have a reasonable alternative, and they live in Langley sometimes because of issues of affordability. They don't have any reasonable transit option to get to work and therefore pay a higher carbon tax. It clearly undermines their support for such taxation, right? When they don't see anything coming back, when they have to effectively be the people that drive, and those who live closer to work, partly because they can afford to live closer to work, those people get a better deal. Those are things we have to change. I'm hopeful that we'll work together over the next number of years, regardless of whether the results of the election. Some people, I was coming down here on the Canada line this morning. I'd been at CKNW this morning, and I had generally have some excellent discussions on SkyTrain. Someone said to me, as they came up to me and said, "Boy, you know, can't wait till you win the election." Which is, I guess, better than hearing the contrary. But the truth is that Premier Clark is a very effective campaigner, as is Mr. Cummins, as is Ms. Sturck, and that elections are up to the voters, not the politicians. The NDP's traditional fate in election campaigns is to do extremely well. You'll recall the last two campaigns, if you follow politics reasonably closely, will know that we did very well. Our leader won the televised debates, and we lost by essentially a swing of 2%. We've won 3 out of the last 21 elections, which is a better record than the Canucks winning Stanley Cups. But, means that you always have to trust the voters. I think the government having run a 4-year period where their singular achievement on the economy was the HST, which hurt the economy coming in, hurt the economy coming out, affected every business. Some felt positively, some felt negatively, but hurt every business to the extent that it was destabilizing the economy over the last 4 years. That is the record. People can say that they were right or they were wrong, but that's the record. The current government's been in place for 12 years. I think in a democracy, alternance plays a role as well. I know the government is going to run this campaign saying, don't elect the NDP, be afraid of the NDP, and making personal attacks on me and other people. But the reality is that there is a problem when one party always rules as well. No alternates means arrogance. And that's a little of what we've seen over the last number of years. But I don't want to win an election because people don't like the Premier. I don't want to win an election because people don't like the Liberal Party. We have an obligation to get a mandate for change, and that's what I intend to do. There are limits to what we can do. We've got to make choices about what the priorities are, and I've talked to you about what I think those priorities are. Skills training, ensuring the productivity of our economy, maintaining effective health and education services, and listening to everybody, not just those that vote for us. This is the approach I've taken as leader of the opposition. One chief of staff, one communications director, one press secretary, one finance critic, one social development critic, one environment critic. We make decisions and we stick to them. That's the approach. That is the record of what we've done. We've said what we're going to do so far, and we've said how we're going to do it in the future. And I think that's the right approach. I think in today's economy, in today's society, we need to make politics more relevant to people. And that means not having private political debates about ancient history, but about talking about this province's future. Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to answering your questions.